Hello and welcome. My name's Tom, people online call me Madders, and welcome to Beyond the Box Art. This week we're going to be harkening back to a model that I painted for Signum Games back in 2024, Paraxis the Scarlet Dragon. Now, there are a number of videos over at a Mini Mad Lad that really belong over here at Beyond the Box Art. And Paraxis the Scarlet Dragon is a prime example. I believe I called the video How to Paint Your Dragon. And Paraxis, so it only got 79 views over at Mini Mad Lad when it used to be called the Mini Mad Cat. And so its removal over there isn't going to negatively affect the channel's watch hours. Plus it's over a year old, so there's no chance it even possibly could. Whilst I'm still acclimatizing to content production and upload frequency here, recycling such videos is of great value and convenience to me. So that video will be removed from the Mini Mad Lad, or a Mini Mad Lad, and it will be, well, it's here. It's here now, you're watching it. So without further ado, enjoy the painting process and my 2-year-old voiceover, which I've kept because I don't think it would be improved upon. I was suffering quite badly from ADHD during the process of painting Paraxis, so it's a little bit scatterbrained, and the point of the voiceover is that I help to bring you through that despite chopping and changing and moving around from one part or aspect of the model to another. I'll see you on the other end. Thanks for watching. On to the painting process. After priming the dragon using a zenithal technique to help bring out the volumes of the model, we applied a 50-50 mix of contrast medium and contrast black Templar through the airbrush to all of the scaled areas of the body, including the fingers of the wings. I'm using a Harder & Steenbeck Ultra with a 4mm needle and cap, with a compressor at around 20 psi. I ended up applying this in 2 layers as the first pass wasn't dark or opaque enough for my tastes. Next, the breath attack was primed much brighter in value using white to increase the visual impact of the green I wanted to lay over it. For the green we used Ada Rowley's light green ink with some thinner medium, and for now that aspect is left alone until later. I'm certain going with undiluted ink for this would have been better. Maybe a dark green wash in the recesses brought up with more airbrush work from the sides to bring out the volumes of the torrent of acid would have worked nicely. However, in this case we revisit the green breath attack multiple times throughout the project. I then start layering up the cream colour on the wing membranes, the soft underbelly from the throat to the tip of the tail, and any other areas that looked to me more like soft tissue than scales, which I decided didn't include the rib cage, which is almost entirely covered with thick armour plate anyway. I use a mix of AK Interactive's Ivory and Citadel's Screaming Skull for this. It takes at least 2 layers, and the amount of surface area to cover here was arguably the majority of the model. I tried to cross-hatch these layers to maximise coverage, but it still takes lots of time. We're using an Artis Opus Series S, size 4 for the entirety of the brushwork for this paint job, but the largest Series S would have been better. Had I had one, I'd have used it. ADHD hits in the middle of applying the second layer of this, and I switched to the face, specifically the eyes. Using Reaper Master Series Lantern Yellow, I applied 2 layers to the eyes, which gives it a pretty solid colour. We then carefully apply a mix of Reaper Violet Red and Vallejo Model Colour Pink to the gums, skin around the mouth, and the tongue as a base layer in 2 thin coats. Instead of returning to the cream, we bounce on to the next part of the sculpt, the armour. As a striking contrast against the green acid, I picked red, and we block out the area using Reaper's Master Series paints Violet Red. This paint is a gorgeous, rich, deep, cold red with excellent coverage and a smooth matte finish. Before I finish that though, my ADHD hits again and I allow myself to be distracted by the acidic breath again. Using the brush, I applied a few layers of the bright green ink all over, which turns the saturation up to 100. There's still no light value contrast at this point, but we'll return to this aspect of the model a few more times before we're done. Returning to the violet red of the armour, I finish off the single coat on the legs and chest plates and the plates running along the curved spine. There are just a few spots I've missed and a few more that need a second coat, but mostly base coat down in one with that paint. After that, I return to the eyes with Lantern Yellow, just pushing the opacity to 100 with a third layer of this warm yellow. We miss the wee little hand thumb armour and add the violet red there before finally returning to the cream. Once I was applying a third layer, I switched to Vallejo's Iraqi sand here to see if the coverage would be better than the mix that I'd been using of the ivory and the Citadel Screaming Skull. It occurred to me that a more efficient approach for this might have been to paint the edges of each section of the wings and then switch to the airbrush to fill the majority of the rest of it much quicker. In the future, I'd definitely try that, and I think it would take less time and probably achieve a slightly better finish at the expense of minimal overspray. Next, I'm blocking out the gold trim and embellishments on the armour plates, using Reaper's non-metallic metal gold shadow. In between, I'm still trying to get full opacity on the creams. Applying so many layers and working at speed, I've made a little mess of them with the cream, so I come in with a mix of greys, maybe a touch of Pterodon turquoise that's dried a little on my palette, to make a cold dark grey with which to redefine the fingies on the wingies. Later, I'll use Black Templar straight from the bottle for the same sort of cleanup. At some point, I decide to work a little more on the seam left by the glue point on the underside of one of the wings, and decide to utilise some UV resin to smooth the area out. And after finding the last areas I'd missed needing the cream treatment, the tootsies and the inner thigh and subsequent cleanup with Black Templar, we apply one more layer of the violet red to increase its intensity despite it having achieved a nice opacity on the armour. And then we're finally ready to break out the airbrush again to do some quick blends on the red armour. Using my Hardware and Steenbeck Cult of Evolution with a 0.15mm tip and needle, I start to layer some Magma Red by Reaper Master Series. I decide on highlight positioning for each facet of the armour as I go, trying to follow and accentuate the shape of the model with each choice, whilst following the direction of 4 imagined equidistant light sources. After Magma Red, we move to an orange, which I think was Chimera Colors orange. We use some cardboard packing to mask and protect the wings and scales from overspray. The sculpt is fantastically dynamic the way it curves around on itself with the wings at the top of their beat. The angles of approach used for the airbrush work would have meant all the cream layering would have been ruined without some basic masking, and we're still going as basic as we can here. We do end up with some overspray, but this is easily fixed. Then we move straight to medium yellow by Vallejo Air and do some airbrush sniper work to maximise our blends, and all that's left for the red is to give the spectral highlights a final dot in the centre of each of them and edge highlight wherever a hard edge could be found. I then continue to use the airbrush to get rid of the red, orange or yellow overspray on the skin using Iraqi sand, and push on to establishing highlights on the wings using a mix of Iraqi sand and ivory. I try to approach them from as flat an angle to the wings as possible with the airbrush to hit the peaks of the ripples and folds, retaining the darker colour in the recesses of the dips and troughs. We then use near pure ivory through the airbrush in the same way, more sparingly, hitting the highest and most protruded parts of the wings. Next up, we restart on the gold non-metallic workup which the entirety of the armour, trim, embellishments and chains will have. It's this part of the paint job that has me the most trepidatious because I'm concerned some of these areas on the dragon will be hard to reach and require a very steady hand. I imagined that supporting the hand would be a greater challenge reaching to the nape of the neck armour or the lower leg at the top of the model, for example. Well, it turned out that whilst not the easiest model to navigate in those ways, I actually found there was almost always somewhere to rest my painting hand using the pinky as I went, and if an angle I was coming from felt at all awkward, I just needed to think outside the box about how I was holding it, and I'd find a relaxing, well-supported position I could come from instead. I used the Reaper non-metallic metal gold triad for this, starting with the shadow colour, moving up in value to the base and highlight, usually finishing with a touch of ivory for the final highlights. I'm working fast here, but with the utmost care to not make a mess, keeping to just the metallic areas I want to look gold. Once all those areas are coated with the shadow colour, I start with the mid-tone base colour. Here I use the positions of the yellow, orange and red highlights I've already established with the airbrush to guide the positioning of the rest of the gold non-metallic metal highlights and blends. I mix between the base and highlight colour for my highlight all over the hard edges of the gold, using the highlight colour on its own only for the upward facing edges and strongest spectral highlights. Mixing a little ivory in with the gold highlight, we hit the centres and peaks where the edges join. Just a little bit, being careful not to overdo this step. The dragon is starting to look nice with the armour more or less complete now. Next I use a 50-50 mix of Guilliman flesh and contrast medium all over the cream ivory skin of the model, which will give us a single step with the highlights later on. I work methodically here to ensure I'm not leaving large amounts to pool in recesses, making sure to cover one area completely, carefully monitored for excess pools accumulating whilst drying, and wicking it out if so. Once dried, I use 50-50 Guilliman flesh and contrast medium again on a few spots I'd missed. Final highlights of nearly pure ivory with the gold highlight on the finest edge highlights and smallest areas inside the peaks and joining edges from the previous part of the gold non-metallic metal, and we can call the non-metallic metal gold done at this point. I then hit all the claws, horns, teeth and tail spikes with straight black Templar and wet blend some ivory for some variation. We then add striations and edge highlights with warm dark greys leading up eventually to straight ivory. The wings get a highlight on the edges and the outward furls of each membrane with Iraqi sand. The final step for the wing membranes is putting random dapple spots at the inner areas of the membrane near the hand, which I think helps add to the sensation that this could have been a wild animal. For this I use a mix of turquoise and black thinned down as a heavy glaze to about 2/3 opacity, which maintains the feeling of the same material by the original colour shining through. After finishing one side each of two membranes, the ADHD hits a final time and we move back to the face of the model. Using violet red with a touch of pink, I start picking out the unarmoured fleshy parts starting with the nose. I inexplicably void my brush and add some water, obviously deciding I didn't like the amount I'd put on, then come in with tiny bit of Screaming Skull to wet blend a highlight. Not a technique or method I would usually use. I pull that blend onto the snout, then pick up more Screaming Skull to lay some basic highlights over a few spots. I go too far with some of those and have to wipe them off and pull them out with water quickly. I decided to continue with quick glazes of Screaming Skull around the snout and eyes. Grabbing the violet red again, I spread a wash consistency over everything I've just done, focusing on the recesses. I then quickly grabbed some ivory and then some Screaming Skull and using the edge of the brush do a quick wet blend. With some final stippling as the blend was drying, I was able to create the effect of arterial activity in the flesh underneath. This ended up working perfectly, as the thinner cold red would form around the thicker green stipples. I then used the same ivory and Screaming Skull mix to put some sharp striations on the edges of the tongue, which was all I needed to make it look animalistic. Still unsatisfied with the skin, deciding it looked a little pale and overly warm, I threw in a wash of turquoise and black which really pushed the contrast, and then came in with really careful pure white wet blends on that turquoise black wash to make highlights that made the face really pop. Finally, the eyes. The last few steps on the skin have rendered the eyeball a little fleshy purple. I glaze some yellow and ivory in a circle, leaving a slit in the middle for the pupil, and repeat again, still leaving a shadow of purple where the slit will go. I drop some violet red in, around the gums of the lower jaw, and do a quick blend with ivory and cream. Drop the same turquoise black wash on top once that's dry, and re-highlight with white, just like the rest of the skin around the face earlier. All that's left to do is the pupil, eye reflections, base, the acid breath, a few more highlights on the left wing, and the rest of the spots, which I did during a stream following the 3-day break I'd had. So, as I was editing this and looking at the raw footage that will be uploaded to Patreon next week, I found several bits that weren't included in the original video, so I've decided to include them here. After that same stream that we've just had on, I started recording again to capture the finishing touches to the acid breath and also some finishing touches to the base, like some sand being applied. It's possible it wasn't included in the original because of the tight camera angle, or I thought the video had gone on too long. Maybe I was sick of editing or was forced onto another task, which it sounds quite likely the latter there. Both, maybe. I think despite the pot of contrast paint that I'm using inks here, fluorescent green and yellow. So we're sort of pooling some fluorescent green in to the recesses. And then I think we end up using the yellow on the outsides of some parts, and then on the very ends of the of the plume of it, where it's all sort of spread out on the edges of there, where there's little wisps of it. I sort of actually tuck it into the recesses there as well, I think, in the end. Just sort of have fun pushing paint around. We're dragging the paint from wells, I think, off camera. I think we must have put a couple of drops into a well each and worked with those. And now we are doing the sand application, which is an AK texture paste sand of some sort. The same one that I used for the Fallout board, I think. And once we've tucked it into a few corners, we add a little bit of water to the brush and spread it out. We repeat this process over and over, occasionally subtracting as well as adding and spreading, as we're doing here. Didn't want it to look all built up next to the acid. I sort of felt like there needed to be a bit more of a clear dividing line, and the grey, dark grey blue provided that. So yeah, we add more and more and more and more, and we get into the little gaps in the corners of the bases between the actual sculpted base and the base that came with it. And the final touch is adding tufts, which were a nightmare, it looks like. We even ended up having to use super glue, but they got on there in the end. I think we trimmed a few. I think we sort of ended up plucking a few heads out. I wanted them to look a little sparser than they were. And I think these tufts might have come from Rival Crafts, which I believe have now shut down. Some of their tundra tufts, I think. Desert tundra, which in this instance was very, very, very appropriate. Anyway, here's the model. I hope you enjoyed the video. As I've said, all of the raw content that shows the painting of the model, so the entire process will be uploaded to Patreon next week, as it's the next project to go up and then clear off my hard drive. If you've enjoyed that video, make sure to give it a like, subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and leave a comment down below. especially if you want to see more painting tutorial content, as without comments to that effect, none are planned for the future of the channel at the moment, other than uploading raw content to Patreon. Subscribe to the Patreon if you really are still here, and I'll see you on the next video.